Thanks, and I can see it. So thank you very much. I want to, in particular, thank Venerable Aoife for inviting me and holding this very interesting and exceptional gathering. This is maybe an effort in a very superficial and clumsy way to stitch together the two previous talks. We'll see. Yes, that's fine. I'm sorry, I can't reach the microphone apparently. So what I want to do here is my assignment was to speak to synthetic embryos specifically, but I want to use them sort of as a jumping off point for thinking about broader questions about how the ethical problems and governance approaches to those ethical problems are conceived in this domain and in related domains, and to foreground how they privilege certain sorts of orientations, certain sorts of conceptions of human life and life more broadly and its significance, and with the consequence of excluding space for other forms of moral imagination. So my hope is to point out how a kind of starting point has already pushed a conversation down a direction that precludes what are fundamentally different, but I think no less essential, perhaps more essential, orientations to that conversation. So let me take a step back from synthetic embryos to something more partial, and that is the sort of work that preceded the kind of work you heard about from Jacob Hanna, looked at the self-organization of organismal parts from cells, basically, from cultured cells, and one of these is the brain organoid. So this is basically a set of neural precursor cells cultured in a particular way that self-organizes into something that has the kind of anatomical shape of a very tiny, a very embryonic brain. And this is the sort of question that was asked about these, as these, and continues to be asked about these, as these artifacts have come into development. Can lab-grown brains become conscious? It seems to me that this is a question about the presence of a self, the conditions of possibility for a self, for the being of an entity, the presence of an entity to which we would attribute a kind of a moral significance. And the same applies in the case of so-called synthetic embryo models. I'm going to say a few words about the terminology itself, whether human or non-human. Is it an embryo? Is it a human embryo? Does it have those organizational features that put it into the category of an entity of moral concern? You've already seen this video, so I'm just going to skip over it. But just to take note, once again, to reinforce that the entities that the Jacob Lab and other labs are growing are complex and have the sort of anatomical features that emerge spontaneously, organizationally, out of putting what are synthetically derived cells. As you heard, you can take skin cells. Venerable Aoife could provide a skin sample to Jacob, who could grow an infinitely expanding embryonic cell line, in effect, and produce an effectively infinite number of synthetic embryo models that are genetically identical, okay? And this, although this is mouse, what you can see is that these are organizationally complex, right? So the question about artificial embryos, which is currently being asked, is very similar to the questions that have been asked around human embryos more generally. That is, do they have the moral status such that they should be included in the category of human subjects to which there are ethical obligations? Are they the sort of thing that should be considered human in a moral sense, such that we should treat them accordingly? And the way that conversation has played out, and this is giving a very superficial summary of a lot of things, is that the question of moral status has tended to very quickly transmute into a question of biological status. So does it have the features that would make it a relevant situate it in the category of the morally significant human. In the case of human embryos, an old argument that has been made is that in early stages of human embryonic development, it hasn't achieved levels of differentiation that would put it into the category of moral concern. For example, the capacity to twin would mean that it isn't a kind of individual because in principle it could become two or more individuals, etc. In the case of the artificial constructs that I've just put up, in a sense, it's more about looking at the kind of features that differentiate it from the natural kind. What does the brain organoid share or not share with the brain, where we can treat the brain as belonging to, occupying some important position in an unequivocally morally significant entity, a human being, and it's sort of parsing the biological differences. I want to make a point about this that isn't so much about what the key differences are, but about how those differences get discerned. So the move from moral status, which is a question about relations, reciprocity, inclusion or exclusion from a collective moral community, which is just as much a question about us, those who would include or exclude, I would argue, as about the entity that's being included or excluded, right? That those questions get transmuted into questions of sort of technical discernment, of scientific expertise. So this is a quote from Robin Lovell Badge, who led an effort recently in the International Society. In So Hyun, who will speak tomorrow, was intimately involved in that, talking about how to approach questions of moral status, in effect, as questions of biological status, for purposes of ethical rightness and wrongness. Blanket bans enshrined in law appeal in their simplicity, yet leave the public worse off and are more vulnerable to dogma or instinct rather than evidence. Guidelines from international scientific societies can offer leadership in reassuring scientists and the public by knowing enough to foster the right kinds of discernment for purposes of inclusion and exclusion. But take note that this framing of the problem places the entity of concern, the synthetic embryo, the brain organoid, whatever, as a kind of isolated entity, as a thing standing by itself that a community steps back from, looks at, discerns, reads, interprets, and locates in one box versus another, the morally significant versus the morally insignificant. This is a just sort of simple schematic of the process from scientific discernment to ethical discernment. But take notice, it's also a kind of a political relation, from expert judgment to values deliberation, to collective deliberation. What is it to what does it mean, right? So there's a kind of right ordering of collective reflection. You might say a right ordering of relations built into this notion. And yet it seems to me that more fundamentally than moral status, which is already a commitment to a kind of individuated moral imagination, already a displacement or occlusion of a set of relations that are very important, that more fundamental is the question of humanness, right? That's in effect what's at stake here. And humanness as you might say an ontological problem, as a problem of being, and then as a problem of ethical relations. And I want to go back to the sort of early days of biotechnology to a quote that I think is quite interesting, partly because it was more about risk, you might say environmental risk, of the emergence of new forms of biotechnology, but it seems no less applicable here. This is from Robert Sinsheimer, who developed techniques that were fundamental in the kind of emergence of the biotechnology revolution in the 1970s. With the development of bioengineering, we leave the security of that web of natural evolution that blindly and strangely bore us and all of our fellow creatures. With each step, we will be increasingly on our own, emerging into a different set of relations. How do we prevent grievous missteps inherently untraceable? So what I want to draw attention to is the traceability or untraceability of those steps that comes in part from how those steps are understood. What's understood to be at stake in those steps, and what forms of moral imagination and of relations, of human relations, are included or excluded from them. So the problem of synthetic embryos, as I've said, has been approached basically as a what are they question. And that question has been primarily claimed by scientific experts who want to give detailed accounts of the ways in which they overlap with and therefore are excellent models for human embryos, and the ways in which they do not overlap with and therefore are distinct from human embryos. But this is quickly shaded into a kind of parallel conversation, you might just say a coextensive conversation, about how to talk about them. So here's just a grab bag of a few quotes with, oh, sorry, I meant to say this first. So this is from the Oviedo Convention, the Convention on Human Rights and Biomedicine, which is the one piece of international law that governs a variety of different domains, including the creation, including use of human embryos in research, covers much of Europe. The Taiwanese law, as I understand it, is essentially the same as this provision. The creation of human embryos for research purposes is prohibited. But how do you know whether it's prohibited or not if you don't know whether it's an embryo or not, right? So here's a grab bag of statements, primarily from scientists, one from a scientific journalist, that is asserting, in effect, that it's unequivocally the case that these are not human embryos. We must remember these models are not actual human embryos. It would be dangerous to compare them directly to in vivo embryos. These are neither embryos nor are we trying to make embryos. Actually, they are just models. Calling these synthetic embryos is rather misleading, even prejudicial. So what's seen at stake here is not just a kind of discernment between two different types of beings, natural embryos and artificial embryos, but also the threat of confusion, the threat of transgressing a distinction where basically the jurisdiction, the authority to draw that distinction is being asserted by experts, okay? So don't have a conversation about the significance, the potential ethical significance of entities that you might want to consider human in some moral sense, because that would be a scientific mistake. So that's the sort of logic of the move. So in that sense, the question, what are they, is simultaneously a question of what should they be called. Because the assertion of the sort of simplicity of that distinction, of course, is much more complex when one gets into the intra-scientific conversations about what are the features of these things that are salient or not for making that discernment. And yet, the moves to shape, to sort of promulgate and solidify the clarity of that distinction are amongst the primary moves that are being made to achieve a kind of ethical clarity. So this is the International Society for Stem Cell Research. One of the calls that it makes is to advise against using the term synthetic embryo to describe embryo models because it is inaccurate and can create confusion. Integrated embryo models are neither synthetic nor embryos. This is the cover, the quite wonderful cover of Cell magazine in which Jacob Hanna published his mouse experiments that you heard about a few minutes ago. Of course, it's a spoof, a play on René Magritte's The Treachery of Images. This is not a pipe. This is not a mouse. This embryo is not a mouse. This is not a mouse embryo, rather. Here's Magritte's sort of explanation of the obviousness of his assertion that this is not a pipe. Could you stuff my pipe? No, it's just a representation, is it not? So if I had written on my picture, this is a pipe, I'd have been lying. Magritte, of course, was professionally, at least for a while, employed as an advertiser. And in sort of reflecting on his own work, he understood his task to be to create representations that would displace the object which the producer was seeking to sell with a kind of artistic representation that was a locus of desire, to engender, to produce an object to artistically produce an object of desire that would lead the person to the pipe and the purchasing of the pipe. But the relation is to the representation of the pipe, which of course is not a pipe. In the case here, there's another step in the story, which I think is quite interesting to think about. There's the cover of Cell magazine, of the journal Cell, but then there's the entity on the other side, whatever that is, your right, that is itself the representation of artifice, if you know what I mean. That's the thing that is not a mouse embryo. And yet, as an organic entity, it is a striking simulacrum of a mouse embryo. I think that the thing to pay attention to here is not only the question of mouseness, but the question of how there's a transmutation of representation taking place. Because the intervention into the human, which becomes of human biology, which becomes a kind of a space of artifice, is also an intervention into modes of representing humanness, into who gets to say what human is and on what basis, in effect. And thus, an intervention into the stakes of declaring that status, of declaring that of the discourse of humanness, of the imagination of humanness. And there's a tendency to think about humanness, the humanness that's at stake in this domain in this sense. The object of scientific manipulation, if human, has a different significance than if the object of scientific manipulation is non-human, and what it means for human life. That human life is acted upon, and the impacts and consequences upon the human life that is acted upon is the focus of moral concern. But I want to draw attention to a couple of other levels as well. There's the idea of the human, the imagination of the human, the understanding of the human, the shared conception of the human, the discourse of the human. Humanness is itself also at stake, something perhaps more ephemeral, something that is less materially located, but surely is no less significant. And in that context, humanness, what's at stake is not just the potential for transgression of, but the authorization of these projects in terms of, for the sake of humanity, for the sake of progress and the collective good. And then the last, and I would say definitely not least, dimension of humanness that's in play here is the dimension of collectivity, the modes through which we are human together. So here I have the politics of reciprocity, recognition, and collective moral imagination. If one is imagining the human and the entity that has a question mark next to its humanness as a kind of isolated object, one is occluding the ways in which the modes of being human together are entirely present in the task of asking the question about its humanness. And that particular commitments to modes of being human together, that is, to being committed to the notion that human life places moral demands upon us, and that there is a particular usness that's implicated there, that is sort of not a feature of the discourse. Indeed, it's sort of displaced from the discourse as the move from moral status to biological status, the ways in which the configurations of authority associated with that move that I referred to earlier sort of occlude it. So, just to give a very practical illustration of this, here is a experiment that was done now a handful of years ago, the production of a chimeric, human, non-human primate embryo. I was at a meeting around the time that this work was done, and the researcher who conducted it said that he halted the experiment for ethical reasons. There was a developmental boundary beyond which he ought not go, even as he asserted that this is not a human being, right? So he was drawing the sort of human, non-human distinction, even as he was sort of laying claim to the responsibility to discern where the ethical limits should be, at least for the moment. So there's a kind of assertion of autonomy and agency that goes along with the kind of expert assertion of the capacity to discern which side of the human, non-human line it lies upon. And it seems to me, and this is sort of to bring it to conclusion, that what's at stake here are not just questions of technical discernment, nor questions of moral discernment, but are the constitutive vocabularies, the shared terms, and the underlying conceptions that inform those terms that get deployed to make sense in these sorts of domains. And that those constitutive vocabularies are, in effect, willy-nilly constitutional vocabularies. They are the ways we think and speak together about the nature, meaning, and purposes of our scientific and technological projects for human life. So the human is undergoing profound articulation and potentially transformation, not only because of course we haven't asked the question of humanness in relation to an artificial human embryo before in the history of human life, but not only in that dimension, but also in the shared conceptions of humanness and how humanness matters or not, and in the relations that engenders between us in adopting those particular kinds of conceptions and the forms of exclusion that they require. Because what goes unthought, what goes unsaid, what is not included in that sort of process of answering a teed-up question configures our socio-political relations. There's sort of shared moral imaginations that are present or not present. So I want to conclude by finally getting around to my assignment here, which is to bring this into conversation with Buddhist perspectives, which I'm utterly unqualified to do, and therefore will probably do quite badly. But I just want to try to draw a distinction here. So this is a quotation from Thomas Aquinas that is on the wall in the Harvard Law School. Human law has the nature of law insofar as it partakes of right reason, and it is clear that in this respect it is derived from the eternal law. But insofar as it deviates from reason, it is called an unjust law and has the nature not of law but of violence. So the tethering of law to right reason, the tethering of law to the underlying nature of things is what authorizes law and gives it its justice. So I took this picture during a coffee break during a meeting that was now 6 or 7 years ago that Insu and Sheila Jasanoff and I were all present at, which was an effort to make sense of how to think about the sort of ethical stakes of the construction of these sorts of entities. It was an early discussion basically about artificial human embryos that preceded the work that Jacob Hanna just presented to us. And it struck me at the moment that in the sort of secular conversation that was unfolding in that room, what was at stake was this question of right reason, and what it means to partake of right reason, and who is the custodian of right reason that would have the authority to deploy it to ensure that everything is right and nothing deviates into the territory of injustice and of violence. And in thinking about my assignment for this meeting, in drawing on my very, very limited repertoire of knowledge of Buddhism, I found myself coming to this story from the Jataka tales, the story of the previous lives of the Buddha, in which Saka, disguised as a hungry beggar, as a hungry traveler, seeking food, and the Bodhisattva, who is in the incarnation of a rabbit, comes into the camp of Saka and throws himself into the fire to serve as Saka's dinner. That this is an act of self-sacrifice, of self-negation for the sake of another that then acquires a kind of cosmological presence. It's inscribed in the surface of the moon. If one begins with a kind of conception of right reason, a conception of the ordering of things, in which it's about locating things in boxes, is this the sort of thing that belongs in the fire, or belongs next to the fire and will eat the thing that's in the fire, one ends up with a fundamentally different imagination of right relations than this story seems to me to present. That this story, for one thing, is about a metaphysics of fluidity, not of fixity, not of types, and is more fundamentally, you might say, about an ethics of relationality and reciprocity, not so much of rights that attach to the right kind of beings, the beings to whom those rights are right and appropriate. And it seems to me that this kind of relation, which is captured, I think, quite profoundly in what is, maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems to me a kind of a fable, the children's story version of a millennia-old religious tradition, is itself a kind of rejoinder to the very first step of the mode of reasoning that I've laid out in this domain of bioethics. That is, that asking the what it is, what should we call it, and thus what should we do about it, displaces relationality and reciprocity to the very end of a kind of a chain, treating it as though it's an afterthought rather than a fundamental input into the undertaking of the project itself. And if one begins with it, what does one see? One sees relations that entail obligations in which one can't get out of them just by parsing things as being one sort of thing versus another thing, but instead recognizing that one exists in a larger fabric in which those ethical obligations are, as I understand it, the basic ontological, you might say even cosmological fabric that has priority over essentially everything else. So, if we see what's at stake in terms of constitutive and constitutional vocabularies, a subtle reversal, not the ways in which the bearing that governing scientific and technological projects have on the nature, meaning, and purpose of human life, but the other way around. The ways we think and speak together about the nature, meaning, and purposes of human life with consequences for, with meaning for, the modes in which we govern our scientific and technological projects. I think it shows how conversations of the sort that are happening here, even if somewhat halting and challenging, are absolutely essential. And it demands that we recognize the ways in which those scientific and technological projects and the sorts of conceptions of what sort of interventions in the world or interventions in human life they are, have already profoundly configured the sorts of conversations that happen or don't happen in relation to ethical judgments. I want to end with these lines from T.S. Eliot, which seem to me to say the same thing in a somewhat different way, that the impulse, the attraction, the desire to escape from the darkness outside and within by dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good, where the knowledge and the modes of technical ordering have been set up such that the questions of obligation evaporate and one need not think too hard about them, that those seem to me to be animating aspirations which we should be profoundly suspicious of, even when we think that they are effective and successful. And that rather, what have we to do but stand with empty hands and palms turned upward in an age which advances progressively backwards, to find new ways to ask questions about the promise of progress, the linearity, and the simplified forms of ethical and political relations that it seems to invite from us. Thank you.